The first thing you must understand is that I did not choose this life. It chose me, reaching back through generations of warriors who bled and died so that one day I would draw breath in that mountain village beneath Fuji's eternal shadow. I was born in the year of the dragon, in an estate where the smell of folded steel and cherry blossoms mixed with every breath I took, where the walls themselves seemed to whisper stories of honor, sacrifice, and death. My family had served our daimyo lord for 11 generations, and the weight of that legacy settled onto my tiny shoulders before I could even speak my own name. From the very beginning, I was not simply a child. I was the next link in an unbroken chain of warriors, and nothing about my existence would ever be ordinary. My first memory is not of my mother's gentle face or her soft singing voice, but the cold, terrifying weight of my father's katana resting in its lacquered stand near my wooden cradle. I remember the way firelight danced along that curved blade, how it seemed alive with some hungry spirit waiting patiently for blood, how even as an infant I understood this object held power over life and death itself. That sword had taken 17 lives in service to our Lord, and someday, though I could not yet comprehend what this meant, it would pass to my own hands. Looking back now across the vast distance of years, I realize that sword was my first teacher, my first warning of what awaited me. My father was a mountain carved into the shape of a man, silent and immovable, his face a weathered map of 32 battles that he had somehow survived when better men had fallen. He looked at me not with the tenderness I would later see other fathers show their sons, but with a calculating expectation that weighed my potential for war before I had taken my first steps across our wooden floors. I learned early that his love was not expressed through soft words or warm embraces, but through the brutal gift of preparation. He loved me enough to make me hard, to forge me into something that might survive this cruel and beautiful world. Every scar on his body was a lesson he intended to burn into my soul, one way or another. By the time my legs were strong enough to carry me across the training yard, I was taught to observe the way my father moved through the world like water flowing around stone, the way he breathed with perfect control in any situation, the way he existed as a living weapon wrapped in layers of iron discipline. I watched him practice kata sword forms in the gray morning mist for hours without rest, his blades singing through the air with a whisper that sounded like death itself speaking, and I memorized every movement with my hungry young eyes. He rarely spoke during these sessions, but his body taught me volumes about what it meant to pursue perfection in violence, to make the sword an extension of flesh and bone and spirit. I did not yet hold a weapon, but I was already being shaped into one. The morning of my 5th birthday arrived without celebration, without sweet rice cakes or songs, without any acknowledgement that I was still a child who might want such things. There was only my father's rough hand pressing my first bokken into my small trembling fingers. That wooden practice sword felt impossibly heavy, as though it were carved from iron rather than oak, and my arms burning within minutes of holding it in the basic ready position. My father watched without sympathy as I struggled, his eyes hard as river stones, waiting to see if I would cry or complain or show any weakness he would need to beat out of me. I showed him nothing but silence, and perhaps that was my first small victory in a lifetime of battles. My father's training methodology contained no mercy, no accommodation for my age or size, no gentle encouragement when I failed. Every mistake earned fresh bruises painted across my small body,
Every hesitation earned shame that cut deeper than any blade could reach. He believed that kindness in training produced corpses on battlefields, that the only love worth giving a warrior son was the love of absolute preparation for the horrors that awaited. I learned to fall and rise, fall and rise, fall and rise, until my body performed this resurrection automatically, until pain became simply another sensation to acknowledge and dismiss. Some nights I could not sleep for the throbbing of my wounds, and I would lie awake wondering if all fathers taught their sons through suffering. I trained alongside other boys from samurai families across our domain, all of us burning with desperate hunger to prove ourselves worthy of the fathers whose shadows we could never seem to escape. We pushed each other beyond exhaustion, competed for every scrap of praise from our masters, formed bonds of brotherhood through shared suffering that I know now are forged nowhere else but in such crucibles of pain and determination. Some of these boys would grow to fight beside me in battles that soaked the earth red with blood, and some would die in my arms, whispering final messages for families they would never see again. But in those early years, we were simply children playing at war, not yet understanding the true cost of the path we walked. There were days when my body simply surrendered, when I collapsed face down into the dirt of the training yard and tasted the copper of blood mixing with dust and failure on my tongue. My muscles would refuse all commands, my vision would blur, my lungs would burn for air that never seemed enough, and I would lie there wondering if this was how death felt, this complete abandonment by a body pushed beyond its limits. The other boys would step over me and continue their drills, because showing sympathy would earn them punishment, and I would hear my father's voice commanding me to rise with a coldness that allowed no disobedience. And somehow, every single time, I rose. But the training of a samurai extended far beyond the merely physical arts of war. We spent countless hours studying poetry that captured beauty in 17 syllables, calligraphy that transformed ink into living emotion, military strategy that treated warfare as a complex game of positioning and psychology. We read the ancient Chinese classics until we could recite them from memory, absorbed the teachings of Confucius about duty and hierarchy and the proper ordering of society, meditated upon Buddhist concepts of impermanence that would help us face death without fear. Our masters insisted that a warrior who was merely skilled at killing was nothing but a common murderer. The true samurai must cultivate the garden of the mind alongside the discipline of the body. We were being shaped into instruments of refined destruction. I learned through years of study that a samurai's mind must be as sharp and dangerous as his blade, capable of perceiving threats before they materialized, capable of composing death poems with the same skill used to end lives. The mental training was in many ways more demanding than the physical, requiring me to sit in meditation for hours while my legs screamed in agony, to solve complex strategic problems while exhaustion clouded my thoughts, to maintain perfect composure while instructors attempted to break my concentration through insults and provocations. My spirit was being forged into something unbreakable as folded steel, hammered again and again until all weakness was driven out and only pure determination remained. This was the true secret of samurai strength. Many nights, long after the other students had collapsed into sleep, I practiced alone under the cold eye of the moon, repeating kata forms until my hands bled and my legs gave out beneath me like architectural columns finally crumbling. I would prop myself against the courtyard wall, catch my breath
for a few precious moments, then force myself upright to begin again. Because somewhere in my young heart I understood that greatness demanded sacrifice that others were unwilling to give. The darkness was my witness, the stars my only audience, as I carved my future, one exhausting repetition at a time. Those solitary midnight sessions taught me something no master ever could, that the only person you must truly defeat is yourself. When I turned 13, my daimyo lord himself presented me with my first real katana in a ceremony that felt like dying and being reborn as something new and terrifying. The great hall was filled with warriors who had watched me grow from an infant, and I knelt before them all as the blade was placed into my trembling hands with words about honor, duty, and the weight of our ancestral legacy. I remember the blade catching torchlight as I raised it, throwing dancing reflections across the faces of men who had killed and would kill again, men I would someday stand beside in battle. In that moment, I was no longer a child pretending at war. I was samurai, and there was no returning to innocence. The weight of my katana was fundamentally different from any practice weapon I had ever held, heavier in ways that had nothing to do with its physical mass, but everything to do with the souls of ancestors watching from beyond death. This blade carried the expectations of 11 generations, the blood of enemies my forefathers had slain, the burden of absolute loyalty that demanded I give my life without hesitation if my lord required it. I learned that the sword was never simply a weapon, but a physical manifestation of my honor, to be treated with reverence equal to that given to religious relics, to be cared for with rituals passed down through centuries. My sword and I would become one entity, inseparable until death finally parted us. I sparred daily with other young warriors for years after receiving my blade, learning through countless exchanges that every clash of steel was a conversation between life and death, conducted in a language of angles, timing, and murderous intent. We wore protective gear and used practice swords for most bouts, but the masters occasionally made us spar with live blades to teach us the difference between theory and the reality of edges that would open flesh without hesitation. I collected small scars during these sessions, each one a lesson about mistakes that would have killed me against a real enemy, each one a gift more valuable than any praise. My body became a record of my education, written in the language of healed wounds. My master spent 3 years teaching me iaido, the devastating art of drawing the sword and delivering a killing cut in one fluid motion faster than conscious thought could follow. We trained this single technique thousands upon thousands of times until my muscles lived in my muscles rather than my mind, until I could draw and cut before my brain registered that I had decided to act. He taught me that the battle is often decided in this first fraction of a second, that a master of iaido has already won before his opponent's blade clears its scabbard. I practiced until my shoulders ached constantly, until the calluses on my thumb grew thick as leather, until the sword seemed to leap from its sheath with a will of its own. Despite the relentless harshness of my training and the constant pressure of expectations that threatened to crush me, there existed moments of quiet beauty that I have treasured across all the decades since. Evening meals with my family, gathered around our low table,
the simple taste of rice and miso soup and grilled fish, my mother's rare smile that emerged like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. My younger siblings looked at me with admiration I did not feel I deserved, and my father's silent nod of approval after meals felt like victories more meaningful than any I would later win on battlefields. These small moments of peace were precious beyond measure, islands of warmth in an ocean of discipline and duty. At 16, I stood my first night watch alone on the estate's wooden walls, gripping my spear in hands that struggled not to shake, suddenly responsible for lives beyond my own in a way that transformed abstract duty into crushing weight. The darkness beyond the torchlight seemed alive with threats my imagination eagerly provided. Every shadow a potential enemy, every sound a possible attack that would test everything I had learned. I stood there for 6 hours without moving, barely breathing, eyes straining against the night until they watered from the effort. By dawn, I understood something that no training could teach, that responsibility for others is the heaviest burden a warrior ever carries. Then one autumn morning, when the maple leaves burned red as blood against gray skies, a messenger arrived at our gates on a horse lathered with sweat and pushed beyond exhaustion, carrying news that would redirect the course of my entire existence. Our clan was called to war against a rival domain that had insulted our lord's honor. I watched from the training yard as my father received the message, saw his scarred face transform with an expression I had never witnessed before, something between anticipation and sorrow that I would only understand years later when I wore that same expression myself. The estate erupted into organized chaos as preparations began, and I realized with sudden ice-cold clarity that everything until this moment had been merely preparation for a truth I was about to confront. I watched my father and the other grisly veterans prepare for war with grim efficiency born from long experience, their movements economical and purposeful as they checked armor for weaknesses, sharpened already perfect blades, made quiet arrangements for families they might never see again. Meanwhile, we young samurai who had never faced real combat gathered together and tried desperately to hide our bone-deep fear behind masks of bravado and eager boasting about the glory we would win. Some of us would not survive the coming weeks, and somewhere beneath our denial, we all knew this truth. I looked at faces I had known since childhood and wondered which of us would return. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I tied my armor's silk cords for the first time with real battle approaching, fumbling with lacquered plates and leather straps I had practiced assembling 100 times, the reality of what I faced sinking through my denial like water through sand. This was not a training exercise where mistakes meant bruises and shame. This was preparation for a truth where mistakes meant screaming death on muddy ground, far from home and everyone I loved. I looked at myself in my mother's bronze mirror and saw a stranger wearing a warrior's face, someone who might cease to exist before the next moon rose. The boy I had been was dying already, being replaced by something harder and more dangerous.
Nothing my masters had described, nothing my imagination had conceived, nothing in any scroll or story had prepared me for the reality of that battlefield, stretching before me like a vision from hell itself.
Two massive armies facing each other across a misty valley, thousands upon thousands of samurai arranged in formations that seemed to extend beyond the horizon, countless banners snapping in the cold wind, announcing clans that would water this ground with their blood. The scale was incomprehensible to my young mind. Human beings reduced to components of vast killing machines, about to crash together with consequences that would echo through generations. I stood in formation, trying to control my breathing, trying to remember everything I had learned, trying not to vomit from the fear churning in my gut. When the war drums thundered and the order to charge finally came, my conscious mind simply ceased to exist, replaced entirely by instinct, and the muscle memory burned into my body through 10,000 hours of training, taking complete control. My legs carried me forward through the chaos, my arms raised my spear in perfect form, my voice joined thousands of others in a war cry that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than my own throat. I ran toward the enemy line not as myself, but as something ancient and terrible that my training had awakened, a killing spirit that had slumbered within me, awaiting this moment. Thought dissolved into pure action, fear transmuted into focused aggression, and I became what my father had always intended me to be. I remember the face of the first man I killed with a clarity that has never faded across all the years since, his eyes widening with surprise and then something like recognition, as though he saw himself reflected in my blade during that final instant. The way his body felt resisting my spear before yielding to the inevitable. The weight of his soul suddenly added to the collection my sword would carry forever. He was young like me, someone's son, perhaps someone's brother or lover or friend, and I ended every possibility his life contained with a movement I had practiced 10,000 times. I did not feel triumph in that moment, but a profound and terrible responsibility that would never fully leave me. I had crossed a threshold that exists in every warrior's life, and the person I had been before was gone forever. After the battle's madness had finally burned itself out, and the screaming had stopped, and the dying had mostly finished dying, I found myself kneeling alone in the churned mud among bodies from both armies, my katana bloodied and my soul feeling hollowed out like a gourd scraped clean of its contents. Cold rain began falling from an iron-gray sky, as though heaven itself wept for what had happened on this ground, mixing with the blood to create rivers of diluted red flowing between the fallen. I stared at nothing and everything, experiencing a silence inside myself more profound than any I had known, the 1,000-yard stare that marks everyone who has crossed from the world of peace into the world of war. I had survived my first battle, but something essential had died nevertheless. Our army returned home victorious in the technical sense that we had achieved our Lord's military objectives, but the column that wound through those mountain passes bore little resemblance to the proud force that had marched out weeks before. We were depleted, wounded, carrying our dead and those too injured to walk, our banners tattered and our spirits haunted. I walked among veterans who no longer seemed like giants, but like broken men held together by duty and nothing else, their eyes holding the same emptiness I felt growing inside my own chest. We had won, and the taste of victory was ashes on my tongue. I understood finally why my father's eyes had always held that particular darkness. I spent many weeks in a Buddhist temple after returning home, sitting in meditation before golden statues and breathing incense smoke, desperately trying to reconcile the way of the warrior I had dedicated my life to with the sanctity of life that the priests taught. How could killing be honorable? How could taking lives serve the Buddha's compassion? How could I carry this weight without being crushed into dust beneath it? The monks offered no easy answers, only the gentle suggestion that these questions themselves were the path, that living with the contradictions itself was a form of enlightenment. I never fully resolved these tensions, and perhaps that unresolved struggle is what kept me human through all the battles that followed. The years accumulated like autumn leaves drifting into piles, each season adding new experiences and new scars, both visible and invisible, and eventually I found myself transformed from student to teacher, from young warrior following orders into experienced samurai guiding the next generation down the same brutal path I had walked. I watch boys now who remind me painfully of myself at their age, full of eagerness and ignorance about what truly awaits them, and I try to prepare them without crushing their spirits entirely. I push them to exhaustion because I know that strength. I wound them with words because I know that hardness. I teach them everything my masters taught me, while hoping somehow to spare them the worst of what I suffered. It is an impossible task, and I fail at it constantly, and I continue anyway. Now, in the quiet evenings of my remaining years, when I clean and oil the same katana that has been my constant companion across 40 years of service, I see reflected in that polished steel every choice I ever made, every life I ended, every friend I buried, every moment of beauty I witnessed between the horrors. My hands are now covered with scars and calluses so thick I can barely feel the silk wrapping of the handle, but they still remember exactly how to draw this blade in that fraction of a second that decides everything. This ritual of maintenance is also a ritual of memory, a conversation with my past selves conducted through the medium of sharpened steel. The sword holds my history better than my own fading mind. I sit on my estate's wooden veranda now in the golden light of evening, watching my grandchildren play games in the garden below, their laughter carrying across the peaceful valley like music from a world I fought to create for them, and I understand finally what it all was for. They will never know the weight of a sword, never feel the terror of a battlefield, never carry the ghosts of men they've killed, and this is victory more meaningful than any battle I ever won. The peace they enjoy was purchased with blood and sacrifice and trauma that would break them if they knew its true cost. I am content with this exchange, this transaction across generations. I would pay it again without hesitation. This is what it truly meant to grow up samurai in feudal Japan, to be forged through relentless discipline into something harder than the steel we carried, to be tested in the fire of combat until all weakness burned away, to carry both the terrible beauty and crushing burden of bushido until your final breath rattles from your chest. It was not glory, though there was glory. It was not honor, though there was honor. It was becoming an instrument of duty so completely that the self nearly disappeared, then slowly recovering enough humanity to appreciate cherry blossoms and children's laughter and the simple warmth of family gathered together. I regret nothing. I am proud of nothing. I simply was what my world required me to be. And now, with autumn closing in and my sword arm finally weakening, I await my final duty with the same discipline my father first taught me in that training yard so very long ago.